Welcome to Eugene Cannabis TV. We got DanK here, and we've got some great stories for you, most of it local, really. And Jeremy's going to start out by, first of all, I got to mention green. Today, as we are filming this, it's St. Patrick's Day, so happy St. Patrick's Day. As you can see, we're in green. As Jeremy said, he smoked his green before he got here. So anyway, we've got an interesting letter to the editor it was in the Register Guard. So Jeremy wanted to read that for us.
U.S. curbs on marijuana have failed. Regarding the March 10th editorial on marijuana law reform, there's no excuse for legislators' failure to lead. The days when politicians can get away with deliberately confusing the drug war's tremendous collateral damage involving a comparatively harmless plant are over. A majority of Americans now support legalizing marijuana. And, by the way, that's what matters. If the majority of the people want it, that's how it should be. More important is the right thing to do. If the goal of marijuana prohibition is to subsidize as violent drug cartels, prohibition is a grand success. The drug war distorts supply and demand dynamics. If the goal is to deter its use, marijuana prohibition is a catastrophic failure. The United States has almost double the marijuana use as the Netherlands, where marijuana is legally available. The criminalization of Americans who prefer marijuana to martinis has no basis in science. The war on marijuana consumers is a failed cultural inquisition and not an evidence-based public health campaign. Our country can no longer afford to subsidize the prejudices of culture wars, or it's time to stop the pointless arrests and instead tax legal marijuana. Robert Sharp, policy analyst, Common Sense for Drug Policy, Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's a great letter to the editor. That was back on March 12th. It was in the Register Guard. When I read this, I thought to myself, that's a great concept. In fact, I kind of was inspired with this. We've already paid our taxes on cannabis. We've been taxed since 1937, which means we've been taxed without representation. That's my new focus, no cannabis taxation. In the past, a lot of people said, well, let's legalize it and then regulate it. And I look back on, as I look at it, like I said, we've been taxed. We've already been taxed, so I'm not really big on taxing cannabis anymore. As our friend Alan Erickson, great letter writer, which you'll hear later, likes to say, here's another opportunity to send a letter to the editor in response. So you can see a good letter to the editor like this, or even a bad one. It's a good chance to answer it and send a letter to the editor, and maybe they'll publish it in the Register Guard, your answer to the Register Guard. So anyway, it's a lot of fun, and that was an interesting letter from Robert Sharp. And speaking of letter to the editor, Alan Erickson today, March 17th, in the Register Guard, wrote an op-ed. And by the way, a quick note about Alan Erickson. Alan Erickson is a former employee of hemp activist and lumber business owner Bill Conde. He's a volunteer for the Media Awareness Project and Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. So what he wrote was, he started out with a quote from Douglas MacArthur: "One cannot wage war under present conditions without the support of public opinion, which is tremendously molded by the press and other forms of propaganda." So Alan writes, this is his op-ed titled "Banning Pot Sales Perpetuates Public Bigotry." I thought that was a great title. I sent him an email and told him he had a great op-ed here, and then he started out with a fantastic opening shot. And Think about that. Banning pot sales perpetuates public bigotry, and that is so true. These cities are all afraid of pot, illegal, think of all the negative connotations. They don't want it in their town, and they're completely ignorant of the situation. Actually, our experience shows that when dispensaries open, crime actually goes down in the neighborhood, not up. Teenage use goes down, not up. It's been shown. It can be shown, and it has happened. But anyway, Alan writes, the casual reader may find some sense in the Register Guard's March 3rd editorial, allow local pot sales bans, but I didn't. Because the editors continue to rely on information generated from the firmly entrenched propagandistic cartel for a foreign drug prohibition. There are some basics that need to be understood about cannabis, its history, and its prohibition by the federal government. At one time, cannabis medicines were sold over the counter and were among the most widely sold medicinal preparations available. The federal prohibition of cannabis is founded on zero facts and instead is based solely on hysterical, racist propaganda. The whole of the drug war, not just the banning of pot, is an internal threat that makes the harm to our nation by the September 11, 2001 attacks pale by comparison. Excuse me. As far as I know, there isn't a county in Oregon that bans tobacco or alcohol outlets outright.
Those are the killers, not marijuana.
Right. Yet it would seem to me that if everyone were working from facts and reality and not reacting to or with scaremongering, counties would be encouraging medical cannabis dispensaries. Alcohol abuse alone costs Oregon's economy well in excess of $3 billion annually. Tobacco use costs Oregon, and thus Oregonians, more than $2 billion in health care costs and lost productivity annually. Tobacco costs cost us almost 7,000 lives per year. Alcohol takes the lives of another 1,000 of us annually.
Wow.
When was the last time the Register Guard covered a story about a fatal cannabis overdose victim?
There isn't any.
How many pothead victims have broken out into, how many pothead parties have broken out into violence around the University of Oregon? Cannabis is actually the safer alternative. The war against pot has taken more lives than the demonized weed ever will or can. There are now more than 200 medical cannabis dispensaries operating at will in Oregon. In all, 289 applications for dispensaries were received by state officials last week under the 2013 Oregon Dispensary Bill. These are businesses that will employ Oregonians. Employed Oregonians spend their money in their communities and pay their taxes. Legal marijuana farms will not decimate Oregon's beautiful and isolated creeks and wildlands as the real criminal syndicates have been doing for years. Colorado collected $2 million in its first month of legal cannabis sales. Are people just smarter on that side of the Rockies than we're on this side of the Cascades? Were there really any real crime, assault, etc., in the cultivation and consumption of cannabis? Community reluctance might be more understandable. However, no one arguing against cannabis dispensaries does so from a factual position. There is less legitimacy to prohibition to drugs than the original alcohol prohibition was at least constitutional. Excuse me. George Washington, the father of our nation, famously said, "Make the most you can of the Indian hemp seed and sow it everywhere." Thomas Jefferson went to great and dangerous lengths to smuggle hemp seeds out of China. So important was the plant to our young nation. I get that there are still pot haters out there, just like some people still can't cross their self-imposed barriers of race or sexual preference. Some folks won't accept the normalcy of cannabis. That's my opinion. They have every right to. That's an opinion they have a right to hold until they start trying to make laws based on their bigotry. To allow counties to allow a product based on a century of fraud, deception and racism just seems, I don't know, un-American. Isn't it a bit hypocritical of this state, where folks love to complain about the federal control of water, timber, or public lands, to embrace the feds when it suits their own bigoted agendas? So that's a great letter from our friend Alan Erickson. That's on the in the March 17th issue of Register Guard. I recommend that you write a letter to the editor in response to that op-ed, and let's just keep the ball rolling. We need to educate people, and that's how we do it, by
yeah, I agree. There's no reason to allow anyone to ban dispensaries.
No, no, not at all. So you got just a few minutes here, and I'm going to make a change here, Jeremy. The next story is a little bit too long to start in this segment, so let's jump into our headlines. We've got the stopthedrugwar.org headlines. We'll just run through them briefly, and that'll finish out this first half. This is the, I'll read the first week if you want to read the second, Jeremy. This is number 824. It was on the week of March 6th. These are, again, just the headlines, and you can go to their website at stopthedrugwar.org and get the full stories. But we just want to run through the headlines just to give you as much information as we can to show you what's out there. War of words. The International Narcotics Control Board versus a changing world. The International Narcotics Control Board issued its annual report on the global drug situation today, and it is very concerned about marijuana legalization. But its chorus of critics is growing larger and louder. The D.C. City Council okays marijuana decriminalization. The District of Columbia City Council has voted to decriminalize small-time marijuana possession. The mayor is expected to sign the bill, but Congress must still approve too. Medical marijuana update. CBD medicine marijuana bills are moving in states that have traditionally been unreceptive to medical marijuana. New Mexico moves to increase supply. Maryland promulgates draft rules, and more. This week's corrupt cop stories. A major scandal envelops 5 San Francisco police officers. A former Illinois probation officer heads for prison in the cocaine death of an Illinois judge. A Kentucky drug task force commander cops ripping off his employers. So that's that for the drug war headlines. And this right now we're going to have to catch this the next one in the next segment. If you want to close out real quick by saying the Inland Empire Hemp Fest volunteer meetings are still happening, third Saturday of every week. Go to our website or get a hold of us to find out the location. And the Emerald Empire Hemp Fest is the fourth. The Valley Normal meetings are the fourth Saturday of every month at 2 o'clock. So we're going to wrap up this segment, and we're going to move on to our second. And I invite you to come down and visit us at the Community CTV 29 studios behind Sheldon High School, around the corner from KRVM. Stop. Welcome back to Eugene Cannabis TV. I forgot to mention in the first half that this is episode 525. Can you imagine that? Since 1994, and we're just still going strong. And you got DanK here and my friend Jeremy, and we're talking about news stories that have come to our attention. A lot of them are local. This is the one. This is a new one that came out today. This is in the Register Guard. This is Associated Press. It came from Associated Press, written by Chad Garland. State voters could face multiple choices on pot. Salem. Paul Stanford, one of the nation's leading marijuana legalization advocates, doesn't only want Oregonians to have the right to smoke pot, he wants it written into the state constitution. Stanford's proposed constitutional amendment is one of several pot questions that may go to Oregon voters in November. Others are offering competing measures for how the state would regulate and tax the drug. We think our voters will just vote yes on all of them, Stanford said last week, adding that if the competing measures both pass, the one with the most votes would trump the other in areas where they may conflict. Advocates for legalization are gearing up for their campaigns now that the legislature has declined to put a measure of its own on the ballot. They will have to gather tens of thousands of signatures by early July. Stanford is already circulating petitions for two separate pot initiatives. One would amend the state constitution to decriminalize pot use, and the other, the Oregon Cannabis Tax Act, would create a commission for regulating marijuana cultivation, processing, and sales. Stanford's effort faces competition from the group New Approach Oregon, which is preparing to push a measure that leaves the Constitution alone and gives the Oregon Liquor Control Commission the job of regulating marijuana like it does alcohol.
That's not exactly the best choice, in my opinion.
Yeah,
alcohol and marijuana are completely different things.
Right, yeah, there's been controversy over that. Anthony Johnson for New Approach Oregon said the group has two slightly different initiatives filed with the the Secretary of State's office, but will go forward with whichever one it feels has the best odds in November. Johnson said he expects to begin collecting the 80,213 signatures needed to qualify one of them for the ballot in as little as a month. But the group is currently waiting for both measures to clear the ballot title process, which could delay those plans. Johnson also has donors lined up to fund the signature drives, which he said could cost between $250,000 and $750,000, depending on how quickly the measure ballot titles can be finalized. He declined to name them, but they're widely believed to include some of the deep-pocketed interests that helped fund successful 2012 legalization drives in Washington State and Colorado. Stanford said he's focusing his resources on door-to-door canvassing to get the signatures his initiatives need by July 3rd. 116,284 for the constitutional amendment and 87,213 for the Tax Act. As of early March, he had submitted less than a quarter of the signatures needed for each measure. But he said his campaign is growing pretty rapidly right now and has gathered more than 10,000 signatures since then. Stanford has reported more than $45,000 in contributions from people giving $100 or less in cash, and says that number is growing too. At least one out-of-state backer, Texas head shop owner Michael Kleinman, has also contributed more than $75,000 to the effort through his nonprofit foundation for constitutional protection. In 2012, Stanford successfully got a marijuana legalization initiative on the ballot, but voters rejected it 47% to 53%. Legalization advocates spent millions helping to get Washington's and Colorado's measures passed, but avoided Oregon, complaining that the measure was poorly drafted and didn't qualify for the ballot in time for them to make an effective case to voters. Stanford also has a contentious relationship with many of the marijuana legalization community. Some of the same groups that funded efforts in Washington and Colorado have already put thousands into Oregon's 2014 initiatives, just not Stanford. The New York-based Drug Policy Alliance and its advocacy arm contributed $60,000 to New Approach in 2013. Both Stanford and Johnson say they're confident they'll get the signatures they need, and both are optimistic that their measures will pass. It's going to happen this year, Stanford said, for sure. So, you're wondering why there's two camps out there not working together. That's the way it is in the legalization community of activists. Dysfunction runs rampant.
It's almost as different as Republicans and Democrats sometimes.
True. So they're both good initiatives. I don't really prefer one over the other. We just need something. I believe that victory is ours to lose in 2014. If we can just get a ballot on, it'll win. We don't need that much for a campaign, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't know, but
right now they all need lots of signatures, so
exactly.
It's hard to say if they'll get them in time.
And it should definitely be happening in Oregon. Oregon's a very progressive state. Oregon was the first state to decriminalize possession of less than an ounce. Oregon was the second state to have medical marijuana. Oregon should have been the first state to legalize. Unfortunately, we're too dysfunctional and we didn't make it. But hopefully we'll do it in 2014, because I'm not willing to wait for 2016. We got too many of my friends that are in jail, and people we don't even know yet are heading that way because of the stupid laws. It's a great plant, lousy law.
Yeah, they definitely need to put in a provision to get people that are in jail for it out when it's legalized.
That's true, and I've heard people say they wouldn't support different measures because that was not part of the measure. But I always like to say that let's don't throw the baby out with a bathwater. If there's a thing or two that should or shouldn't be in it, we can't stop and rewrite the whole thing. That's the way it's been written, and it's half. So anyway. The main thing is to sign the petitions when you see them, so that we can get it on the ballot. Signing a petition doesn't mean you vote for it. That just means that you're willing to have it on the ballot so other people can vote on it, and that's what it's all about. So don't be hesitant to sign the initiatives, for heaven's sake.
Exactly. If you see any of them, sign them all. That'll give people a chance to vote for it.
Exactly. And so here's another story that fairly recently we got kind of a kick out of. This is from the Huffington Post. House Republicans want to sue the president for not arresting people for marijuana. So, I mean, this is
and my question is, how stupid do you have to be to try and sue the president of the United States of America?
Yeah. And so it's really, about the time you scratch your head and you think you heard it all, and then something else comes up. So the Republican-controlled House passed legislation on Thursday to force President Barack Obama to crack down on states that have legalized marijuana in any form. Introduced by Representatives Trey Gowdy, Republican, South Carolina; Darrell Issa, Republican, California; Jim Gerlach, Republican, Pennsylvania; and House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Gladlatte, Republican. The Enforce the Law Act would allow the House or the Senate to sue the president for, quote, failure to faithfully execute federal laws, including those related to immigration, health care, and marijuana. President Obama has established a disturbing pattern of cherry-picking the laws he wishes to enforce, ISIS said in a statement. The Constitution charges the president with the responsibility to faithfully execute all the laws and not just the ones that he supports. A Judiciary Committee report submitted by Goodlatte last week regarding H.R. 4138 chastised the Obama administration for selective enforcement of the Controlled Substance Act, which prohibits marijuana outright. The decision by the Obama administration not to enforce the CSA in entire states is not a valid exercise of prosecutorial discretion, the report says. The guidance of U.S. attorneys establishes a formal department-wide policy of selective non-enforcement of an act of Congress. This infringes on Congress's lawmaking authority by, in effect, amending the flat prohibitions of the CSA to permit the possession, distribution, and cultivation of marijuana so long as the conduct is in compliance with state law.
My question is how many of these Republicans that are against it are representing states that are for legalization of marijuana? They need to be focusing on what the people of their states want, not what they want.
Yeah. Yeah, and so even if, it's still not, it's not going anywhere. It's Republican Ed Perlmutter, Democratic sponsor of several marijuana-related bills, said the bill is not going anywhere in the Senate. It's dead on arrival. So don't worry about it. It's not going anywhere. But it's just, I mean, the fact they're even wasting time, even just talking about it, shows how ridiculous it all is. So real quick, the end of the show. Last week we mentioned the Colorado Department of Transportation is running some ads, and 30-second ads to try and get people not to drive under the influence of the marijuana because of the new recreational law. So we didn't have time last week to show you those three commercials. So we're going to be showing those to you here coming up at the end of the show. Again, these are from Colorado. Encourage people not to drive under the influence.
They were actually pretty stupid, Ed, but that was their point, to try and make stoners look stupid and say this is how you look when you're stoned.
Yeah, they got a 5.0 nanograms tolerance, way too low. See you next week. Thanks for stopping in.